Tonight, you face the longest and coldest night of the year, and a strange claim to test against it. For most ordinary people in medieval Europe, winter, not summer, was in its own way the gentlest season. Not the warmest, not the easiest to survive by any obvious measure, but the gentlest, because for once the fields made no demands at all, and a body was finally, briefly allowed to rest as hard as it had worked every other season of the year. If quiet history like this helps you unwind at the end of a long day, you are welcome to follow along, though only if these evenings genuinely do you good. Tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what hour it has reached where you are. Now let the room grow dim, and settle where you lie. Come with me into one ordinary household, on one ordinary winter night, and see what that strange claim about gentleness actually meant. Nothing about that claim is romantic, and by the end of the night you will have seen exactly which ordinary arrangements were doing the actual work. You feel it before you see it. Dusk, and colder than dusk has any right to be. A single low house sits against the dark, its walls thick, its one door shut fast, a thread of smoke rising straight up from a gap in the roof above it. Inside, a family is already gathering itself in toward the middle of the one room they have, the way living things gather in toward warmth without ever needing to be told to do it. Warmth in a room like this has a center and an edge, and everyone here knows without discussion which of the two they are currently occupying. You will find no hallway to cross here, and no second room to retreat to if this one grows too loud or too close. The fire sits in the middle of the floor, on bare packed earth, and the smoke it makes has nowhere clever to go. It simply rises and fills the open roof space above, and the family breathes it in along with the warmth, and has long since agreed, without ever once discussing it aloud, to call the whole arrangement cozy, rather than admit it is, strictly speaking, a house quietly filling with smoke. The smoke is not a design failure. It is the price of the only heat available, paid nightly and without much comment by everyone breathing it. You duck slightly out of pure habit as you step through the doorway, though the roof inside is really high enough not to need it, and pass from the last grey light outside into a room that is somehow dim and glowing at the very same time. Faces catch the low orange firelight. A pot hangs over the flames, giving off a good, plain, comforting smell. Somewhere past the hearth, out in the deeper dark, something large shifts its considerable weight and size. You will meet that weight properly in a moment, and when you do, the whole shape of the room will make a great deal more sense than it does now. That something large is a cow. Some houses this size and shape keep several, because the honest truth, once you look past the flames and the smoke, is that this family's actual heating system is not only the fire burning in the middle of the floor, it is also, quite literally, several tons of living, breathing livestock tethered at the far end of this very same room, doing its own slow, patient, entirely unpaid share of the night's heating work. Nobody calls it heating, because nobody needs to. The animals are there because there is nowhere else for them, and the warmth is a side effect no one wastes. Cattle give off a steady, considerable warmth simply by existing, and a household that has them indoors through winter is quietly better off than one that does not. You settle onto a low bench pulled close into the hearth, and the heat of it reaches you in that particular way winter heat always seems to, arriving first and most generously at your knees and your hands while your back somehow stays stubbornly, persistently cold. Someone passes you a wooden bowl without a word. The pot it came from has clearly been simmering all day, and by the rich, settled smell of it, very probably considerably longer than merely that. A pot kept going like that is less a meal than an institution, and tonight's bowl is only the latest withdrawal from something considerably older. There is, you slowly come to realize as the evening settles, no real privacy here at all, and nobody in the room seems to expect any in the first place. Sleeping arrangements turn out to be less a matter of separate rooms than of whose turn it happens to be tonight to sleep nearest the wall, farthest from the cold draught by the door, and safely upwind, in every practical sense of the animals. Tonight, tired and grateful simply to be warm at all, you find you do not mind that in the slightest. Comfort at this hearth is comparative rather than absolute, and by the standards of the fields you worked all summer, this counts easily as luxury. You are inside a house that, like most ordinary houses built in this age, has no upper floor to speak of, and certainly no chimney worth the name. Its one central hearth burns directly on open ground, and the smoke it steadily makes simply rises into a single tall open roof space running the whole length of the building, with nothing at all above the fire itself but bare timber, aging thatch, and a slowly, steadily thickening layer of soot. That soot is doing quiet work of its own, and centuries from now it will be the reason anyone can tell which roof timbers once stood over an open fire. Nobody in this room considers the soot a problem worth solving, and in fairness to them it is currently holding the roof timbers together. You look up, eventually, because the smoke keeps drawing the eye whether you mean it to or not. It does not simply vanish the moment it leaves the flames. It gathers under the roof in a slow grey layer, thinning only as it climbs, and finds its own way out mainly through one lantern-shaped opening set directly above the hearth. There is no proper flue here to guide it politely outside. There is only patience, and one plain hole cut exactly where the smoke was always going to drift toward anyway. It is a hole, and it is enough, and asking it to be cleverer would require a technology this household has never once had reason to want. It is not, if you are honest with yourself, entirely comfortable breathing this. Your eyes sting faintly, low down near the good warm air close to the fire, and your throat catches once or twice before it settles. But everyone else in the room seems entirely unbothered by any of it, moving easily through the haze the way you might move through a familiar smell in your own home, no longer quite noticing that it is there at all. Your eyes stopped stinging some hours ago. The body adjusts to the room it is given, which is most of what living here quietly consists of. Because this is not, you slowly understand, a bedroom that merely happens to have a fire in it, the way you might first picture such a room. This one open, smoky space is the whole of the house. It is where the family cooks and eats and works and argues a little and mends its clothes and will eventually, all together, sleep, all of it in the very same firelit air, because there is nowhere else at all in this particular building for any of that to happen instead. Cooking, eating, working, talking, and sleeping all happen in the same air, because there is only the one room, and the fire sits in the middle of it. Privacy in the modern sense is not absent because nobody wants it. It is absent because the building has never once offered anyone the option of it. You will find rooms with proper flues and separate private chambers elsewhere tonight, in the homes of people considerably richer than this family will ever be. Chimneys are spreading, slowly and unevenly, through the wealthier houses of this age, one grand hall at a time, but that particular spread will take a very long while yet to reach an ordinary household like this one, and tonight, quite plainly, it has not reached this far at all. Chimneys exist somewhere by now, in houses far grander than this one. Their absence here is not backwardness, only the ordinary sequence in which useful things spread. The change arrived unevenly, reaching wealthier households first, and ordinary ones like this a good deal later, over generations rather than years. Look up again at the blackened timbers holding the thatch steady above you. Long after this particular fire has burnt down and gone cold, long after everyone gathered in this room tonight has lived out their lives and died, those same dark, smoke-stained rafters will still be sitting up there in the roof, quietly proving that this house existed and burned exactly this kind of open, chimneyless fire to anyone who ever thinks, centuries later, to look closely enough to notice. Smoke-blackened thatch is now a recognized category of surviving evidence, which means this exact inconvenience is the reason anyone can still picture the room at all. The cow you noticed shifting at the far end of the room is not, in fact, an unusual sight in a house built along these particular lines. In dwellings shaped like this one, a single long structure often holds both the family's living space and a separate section set aside for cattle. the two divided only by a low partition wall, or simply by a stretch of open floor, with one shared door letting both the people and the animals in together, out of the same bitter cold. One door, one roof, one stretch of floor, and both halves of the household coming in out of precisely the same weather together. Through the long hours of this particular night, the one you are living through right now, that whole arrangement will quietly earn its keep. The animals' own steady body heat, multiplied simply by their considerable size, adds a slow and constant warmth to the shared air that the hearth fire alone could never quite manage by itself. And it costs the household nothing beyond the fodder those same animals would have needed to eat, regardless of exactly where they happened to be standing tonight. The fodder was going to be eaten wherever the cattle stood. Standing them here simply meant the heat came back into the room instead of out into the yard. You glance again toward that dim, shadowed far end of the room, where the broad shapes of cattle shift their weight and settle heavily against one another. Nobody here has stopped tonight to name them, at least not that you have overheard. They are simply present, the way the fire itself is simply present, quietly doing the one plain job this particular cold night genuinely requires of them, and nothing more sentimental than that. Nobody sentimentalizes them. They are warm, they are necessary, and in the morning they will need feeding exactly as they always do. They were brought in because the weather demanded it, and the warmth they give back is a convenience nobody planned but everybody now relies upon. It is the very same arrangement, this one house sharing its hard-won warmth with its own animals, that you would find repeated in countless other houses very much like it, in countless other cold places, all built on the same plain, unglamorous logic. No chimney for the people inside, no separate barn set apart for the beasts. One shared roof, one central fire, one smoky communal warmth for whoever happens to be living, tonight, underneath it together. Long houses like this one are well documented on Dartmoor and across northwest Europe, which means the arrangement was thoroughly ordinary rather than eccentric. You will notice small practical details to this closeness that nobody here troubles to mention aloud, and yet everybody manages without complaint. A shallow channel is cut into the floor on the animal's side of the room, low and entirely unremarkable, so that whatever the cattle leave behind them has somewhere sensible to drain away, rather than toward the sleeping family. It is not an elegant solution. It works, which tonight, in this particular room, is really the only standard that matters at all. There is a drainage channel cut at the lower end so the waste runs clear of where the family sleeps, and that is the whole of the engineering involved. The channel was cut when the house was built, by someone who had thought carefully about where waste would run once the cattle came inside for the season. You will not live to see it, but someday, houses built like this one will slowly begin to change their shape. Solid walls will eventually rise between the people and their animals. Upper floors will appear overhead, carving small private sleeping chambers out of what used to be one single open room shared by everyone and everything alike. But that particular comfort belongs to a much later night than this one, and nobody gathered here is sitting up waiting for it to arrive. Separating people from animals properly, with enclosed fireplaces and inserted upper floors, belongs to a considerably later stretch of the medieval period than this one. Above the table where you sit, wedged carefully into a crack in the wall where it cannot easily be knocked over, one single thin taper of light burns low and orange in the gloom. It is not a candle, whatever it might resemble at first glance. It is a rushlight, a peeled stem of ordinary reed, dipped again and again through melted kitchen fat, until enough of it had gathered steadily along its length to burn through a portion of the evening. The rind is peeled away but for one thin supporting strip, and the pith beneath is dried and dipped through melted fat until it will hold a flame. Gathering the rushes was itself an afternoon's walk, usually done by whoever could be spared, in a season when nothing else needed doing outdoors. It is, by any modern standard you might bring to it, an almost comically small ration of light for an entire household to share between them for a whole evening. And yet everyone here has long since quietly built their routine around exactly that limitation, simply finishing whatever needed doing before that one small flame runs inevitably out of itself and into darkness once again. Light here is a quantity rather than a condition. You are given a length of it, and after that you are given the dark. Long after you and everyone here are gone, a country parson with a curious, patient mind will sit down and describe, in careful and loving detail, exactly how an ordinary household makes one of these small lights for itself, peeling the rush, drying it properly, dragging it slowly through the warm fat again and again. He will be writing about his own 18th century parish, not about this particular night at all, though the humble craft he so carefully describes is already old, and already ordinary, long before he ever sits down to notice it. Gilbert White wrote his description in 1789, long after nights like this one, which is a useful reminder that the craft outlived the century that needed it most. That much later observer, whose world you would not recognize, will even measure one such rushlight for the record, purely out of a naturalist's curiosity, holding a careful eye to something this household would never once have thought worth timing so precisely. A rush a little over 2 feet in length, held steadily to a flame, and burning for rather less than a full hour before it gutters, quietly, into nothing at all. White measured one at 28.5 inches, and found it burned for roughly 57 minutes, which is about as precise as a medieval evening ever gets. Less than an hour from this household's entire prepared ration of proper light for the whole evening, whatever mending remained, whatever quiet, careful task still needed doing after supper had been cleared away, had to fit itself inside that one narrow, flickering window of usable light, or else wait, unfinished, for tomorrow's daylight to return and pick it up again. There is a particular, low, steady urgency to an evening measured out that way, a small, silent tax laid on every single task that happens to involve seeing anything clearly at all. Some households, wanting a longer, if noticeably dimmer light for sitting up through a sick relative's restless night, or a long private vigil, deliberately left a second thin strip of rind on the rush instead of stripping the whole stem bare. Tonight, watching this one small flame in the wall gutter and dip and slowly recover itself, you begin to understand that same small daily arithmetic of light, weighed carefully against time, one this whole quiet room has clearly worked through 1,000 evenings before you ever arrived at its door. A variant left 2 strips of rind instead of 1, burning dimmer but considerably longer. For anyone willing to trade brightness for time, there is no debate happening tonight over which particular kind of rushlight to burn. No discussion of ratios or careful trade-offs spoken out loud between the family members. That choice, whichever one this household has settled on, was made long before this evening ever began, decided quietly by simple habit, and by whatever spare fat and cut rushes happened to be sitting ready this particular winter. A rush left with 2 strips of rind still on it burns fainter than a fully peeled one, but for considerably longer, a plain trade that any tired household understands instantly, without a single word of explanation ever needing to be spoken. What is left tonight is only the simple fact of it burning, low and orange, throwing one small circle of true light into a room otherwise lit by nothing more than the hearth's steady red glow and whatever faint memory the eye still carries of daylight. You watch it a while, half hypnotized the way you might watch a candle flame now, only dimly aware that in a house built exactly like this one, that single small flame is doing considerably more genuine work, for considerably less spared material, than it will ever again be asked to do in this same family's later, brighter, more forgiving centuries. Wax and tallow candles existed and cost money. The rush cost an afternoon of walking and whatever fat the kitchen could bring itself to spare. A household that could afford wax would use wax. This one peels rushes, and does so without any sense of hardship, because it is simply how light is made here. The bowl warming your 2 hands is not, it turns out, the only thing this household is quietly living on tonight. Somewhere close by the wall, kept carefully out of the worst of the damp, hang the plain results of a much older piece of work, finished many weeks before the first hard frost ever arrived to test it. Strips of salted, smoke-darkened meat, a modest, careful store of grain set aside in sacks, onions and dried peas in their own dark corner, kept well away from any stray damp that might spoil them before spring. All of it the unglamorous but entirely essential harvest of one particular autumn day, the 11th day of November, when this household's whole approach to surviving the winter ahead had already, in effect, been quietly decided for them. Weeks before the first real cold arrived to test whether the decision had been the right one. That day carries a name of its own, tied to a saint's feast, and every household within reach of a market town or a lord's manor understood, without needing reminding, roughly what it meant each year when it arrived, once again steadily on the calendar. Martinmas falls on the 11th of November, and everyone on the manor knew what its arrival required of them, without needing to be told. You should not picture this as some wholesale slaughter of every animal on the place at once, whatever the tidy shorthand of later ages might suggest. Far from it, in fact. The animals this household most depended on for the whole year, still ahead of it, its careful breeding stock, its patient milking cows, were deliberately, quite carefully kept alive straight through this particular cull, however hard and cold the coming winter already looked from where they stood shivering in the yard. What went instead to the knife were mainly the pigs, fattened patiently all autumn long on fallen acorns and beech mast gathered from the nearby woods, and the older working animals whose useful years had already, quietly and without much ceremony, come to their natural end. A goose or two, kept fat on stubble since the harvest, went the same way. The entire point of the day was managing scarce winter fodder sensibly, not emptying the yard of every living thing simply for the sake of it, and every household on the manor understood the difference perfectly well, without needing it explained. The animals kept alive past that date were breeding stock and dairy animals, and the reasoning behind each decision was arithmetic rather than affection. What you would have seen follow the actual killing was, if anything, considerably more laborious than the killing itself had been. Meat, left entirely to its own devices, does not preserve itself through wishful thinking alone. It had to be soaked for several long days in strong brine, turned by hand more than once, then hung patiently in steady smoke until it dried through and darkened enough to keep for months rather than days. Skins were carefully scraped clean of fat and hair and cured slowly into usable leather for boots and harness. Even the blood itself was caught in a wide bowl and saved with real care, worked into dark, dense puddings that would keep about as well as anything else the household managed to prepare that whole demanding week. Almost nothing from that single hard day's work was ever allowed to simply go to waste, because in a household like this one, almost nothing genuinely ever could afford to be wasted at all. Skin was cured into leather, fat was rendered and sealed away, and the parts that could not be preserved at all were eaten first while they still could be. Two entirely separate, entirely practical problems were quietly being solved at once by that same single day of hard, bloody, necessary work. One was simple household arithmetic, done without a single sum written down anywhere. Every animal that did not strictly need to survive the coming winter was one less hungry mouth competing for fodder that was already visibly running short as the year turned steadily colder and the grass stopped growing in the fields outside. The other problem was supply, plain and simple and just as pressing. That same culled meat, once properly salted through and thoroughly smoked over a slow fire, became the actual physical store of food that would carry this exact household, this very room you are sitting in tonight, safely through every one of the long, cold, fieldless months still stretching out ahead of it. Fewer hungry animals left to feed all winter long, and considerably more food already carefully banked away against the stretch of months when almost nothing fresh could be grown or gathered from the frozen ground at all. Flesh soaked in brine for days before it was hung to dry and smoked, which is a great deal of labor for meat nobody would taste until January. Brine, drying and smoke were the only preservation available, and each of them takes days that have to be found somewhere in November. Had you arrived here a few short days around that autumn cull, before the salting was properly finished and the smoke had done its slow, patient work all the way through, this household would genuinely have feasted, and feasted rather well by its own ordinary standards, not from any sudden burst of generosity or celebration purely for its own sake, but from the plainest, most practical kind of logic there is to be found anywhere on a working farm at the turn of the year. Fresh meat that has not yet been properly preserved does not simply wait patiently on a shelf for someone to get around to it eventually, whatever a modern kitchen might assume. It spoils, quickly and thoroughly, within days rather than weeks. Far better, then, by any sensible reckoning available to them, to eat well for a brief handful of autumn days on the parts not yet fully cured, than to let good, hard-won meat rot away entirely while everyone stood politely on ceremony around it, waiting for a more dignified moment that would never actually come. The feast itself was eaten around the fresh meat of the cull, and its brief abundance is explained entirely by what could not yet be preserved. That short, unusually well-fed autumn stretch is the entire, thoroughly unglamorous explanation for what later, more distant ages would remember fondly, and rather romantically, as a proper feast day worth marking on the calendar. Not indulgence pursued purely for its own sake then, but a household eating sensibly around the practical edges of a harder, far more careful piece of seasonal work, turning a whole year's worth of fattened, aging animals into salted, smoked, blood-thickened stores that this very same family is, right at this moment, quietly eating its way through, one modest winter bowlful at a time, in exactly the smoky, fire-lit room you happen to be sitting in tonight, weeks and weeks after any of that autumn labour was actually finished. The pot in front of you tonight is drawing on work finished weeks ago by people standing out in the cold with knives and salt. That bowl warming your two hands, in fact, is the plainest possible evidence of this whole careful system working exactly as it was always intended to. It holds pottage, a thick, entirely ordinary stew of grain and dried peas, and whatever small scraps of last autumn's preserved meat happen to be on hand tonight, all of it cooked slowly together in one heavy iron pot that hangs, day after unbroken day, directly over this same steady hearth fire, filling the smoky air with a smell far richer than the bowl itself will actually turn out to be. The smell of it fills the whole smoky room by now, mingling with wood smoke until the two are almost impossible to tell apart. Wood smoke and cooking smell settle into the same air and stop being distinguishable from one another, which is simply what this room smells like. You would find that particular pot sometimes described, in accounts written a very long time after nights exactly like this one, as a kind of cauldron that was never properly emptied at all, only ever quietly topped up, meal after meal, for years and years on end without pause or interruption. It is a vivid and memorable image, one that has been repeated often enough to feel like settled fact, and it may not, in strict truth, be entirely literal in every single household across the country, but it does capture something recognizably true about a pot exactly like this one, simmering for long, unbroken stretches, refreshed rather than restarted from scratch, far more often than it was ever properly scoured right down to bare, cold, empty iron, and started over. The cauldron was topped up far more often than it was emptied, and the one reliable break in that routine came at Lent, when it was properly scoured. Lent aside, the pot's contents are less a recipe than a running account of everything the household has had spare since roughly autumn. What you would actually find going into that pot shifts quietly, almost without anyone deciding it out loud, with the slow turning of the seasons just outside the door. In the warmer, greener months, fresh leaves and whatever herbs happen to be growing nearby find their way into it easily enough, added almost without a thought as someone passes the garden on their way in. Tonight, deep in the very heart of winter, it is dried peas instead, and stored oats, and whatever hardy root vegetables the autumn cellar still has left to offer after months of steady use, quietly carrying this one meal through the long stretch of months when nothing green grows anywhere nearby at all. and will not again for some time yet. Dried peas, oats, and stored roots carry the meal through the months when nothing green is growing anywhere within reach of this door. Nothing green will grow within reach of this door for months yet, and everything eaten between now and then is already sitting in store somewhere. Do not imagine, from the rich warmth of the smell alone drifting toward you across the room, that this particular bowl is genuinely rich in substance once you actually taste it. Most pottage very much like it is thin, closer in truth to a savoury broth than to any hearty modern stew you might picture, simply because grain and fat are both far too valuable here to be used at all generously on any single evening. A little of each has to be stretched, quite deliberately and quite carefully, across an entire household and an entire long hard season, one modest bowlful at a time, night after night, for months on end without complaint from anyone at the table. Most ordinary pottage was thin and largely water, because grain and fat were valuable and had to be stretched across a household and a whole season. You should know there is one clear, definite break coming eventually in this pot's long, unbroken simmering routine, though it belongs to a rather different season than the one gathered around it tonight. When the fasting weeks of Lent finally arrive in the spring, meat vanishes from the household's diet entirely for a time, and the pot itself is far more likely, at last, to be properly emptied out, scraped clean, and thoroughly scoured before it begins its next long stretch of plainer, meatless fasting broths that will carry the household toward Easter. Tonight, deep in the settled heart of winter, that particular reckoning still lies safely, comfortably far away on the calendar, and nobody at this fire is thinking about it yet. The reckoning comes in late winter, when the stores have thinned and spring has not yet arrived. Tonight sits comfortably before that. Sit with the whole of it now, for just a moment, before the evening moves on. The smoke gathered overhead in its slow grey layer, the animals breathing steadily somewhere in the dark at the far end of the room. The one small rushlight burning low in its crack in the wall. The pot that never quite fully stops simmering. None of it, looked at honestly and altogether, was ever some oversight or some simple failure to arrange things better than this. It was a complete, coherent, carefully balanced system, each uncomfortable piece quietly paying for some other piece of warmth or food elsewhere in the room, built with real and patient care towards surviving precisely this one long, cold, entirely ordinary night, and the many more nights just like it still to come. Every uncomfortable detail you have noticed tonight turns out, on closer inspection, to be load-bearing in exactly this same quiet way. Every arrangement in this room turns out to be carrying weight, which is the ordinary condition of a house with no margin anywhere in it. The smoke you have been steadily breathing in all evening was never, in truth, a simple design flaw waiting to be fixed by someone cleverer who simply hadn't thought of it yet. It was the exact, quite unavoidable price of a single open fire that also had to heat and cook for and dimly light this entire room all at once, with no flue yet clever enough to carry it politely away outside instead of up into the rafters. Every small sting you have felt in your eyes tonight has been bought, quite fairly when you think it through properly, with a measure of warmth you would have missed far more sharply than you now mind the smoke that came bundled with it. The smoke and the warmth arrive together and cannot be separated, and given the choice on a night like this one, the household would choose them again. Ask anyone here whether they would prefer a clear-aired room and a cold one, and the question would not be understood as a serious question at all. The animals you hear breathing steadily in that dim, shadowed corner were never simply tolerated for want of a better arrangement somewhere else on the property. They were doing useful, genuinely measurable work tonight, quietly adding their own considerable share of body warmth to a room that badly needed every degree it could reasonably gather from any source at all, and doing it at no cost whatsoever beyond the fodder they would have required regardless of exactly where in the building they happened to be standing tonight, tethered or otherwise. Their fodder was a fixed cost of keeping them alive at all, and the heat coming off them tonight is the nearest thing to a refund available. The single small rushlight burning low was never, either, a straightforward sign of simple poverty, in quite the way you might first be tempted to assume from a modern, brightly lit vantage point used to flicking on as many lamps as a room requires. It was a precise, genuinely sensible answer to a precise and sensible question this household had asked itself many times before tonight. Exactly how much light did this evening's remaining tasks truly require, and exactly how much spare fat could this household reasonably afford to give up in order to provide it? The flame matched the actual need closely, no more and no less. It was never once meant, by anyone in this room, to do any more than that small job. The Louvre was cut to let smoke out, and it does that. And it was never once asked to do anything more ingenious than the salted, smoke-darkened stores you saw waiting patiently by the wall tonight were never any kind of lucky accident either, however comfortable they might now feel to simply lean on and take for granted. They were the direct, entirely deliberate result of hard, bloody, carefully managed work finished many weeks earlier, in an altogether different season, by the very same tired hands now resting quietly around this fire tonight. Whatever ease this household enjoys this particular evening, however modest that ease might look from the outside, was fully and properly purchased back in November, and not one single day later than that. November bought this evening. Everything comfortable about tonight was paid for in cold work weeks ago by people now asleep in this same room. One by one, around you now, the household begins its own small, familiar closing rituals for the night, the same small rituals repeated without much thought every evening of the year. Someone rakes the glowing coals into a lower, steadier heap, banking them carefully the exact way a fire like this one is banked every single night of the year without fail, summer or winter alike. Someone else checks, briefly and entirely by long habit, that the animals are settled properly and tied securely for the long night ahead of them all. The rushlight, already burning low in its crack in the wall, is quietly, deliberately not relit again tonight. Light is spent deliberately here, and once the work is finished, there is no reason left to buy any more of it. You find your own place near the wall at last, away from the worst of the draft that creeps in around the door, close enough to the newly banked fire to still feel its last, patient warmth pressing gently against your back through the dark. The cattle shift once more in the far corner, and then, at last, go properly still. The smoke overhead thins slowly toward almost nothing at all as the fire settles, and the whole coherent, smoky, animal-warmed system of this one ordinary house settles too, altogether, gratefully, into sleep. Fire, animals, roof, and people settle at once, because they are all parts of one arrangement rather than separate things sharing a building. Everyone lies down within a few feet of the fire, because the far corners of the room are barely warmer than the yard outside them. Wind the story back now, past this one long winter night, to a cooler autumn morning some weeks earlier, in the same yard behind the same low house. The light here is thinner, more golden than the deep blue dark you have just left, and the air smells of wood smoke and something else underneath it, sharper and more metallic, carried on a cold breeze from the stubble fields beyond the fence, already stripped bare after the harvest. The household is at work outside, gathered around a low fire and a scrubbed wooden bench, and what they are doing is neither cruel nor careless, however it might look at first glance to an unprepared eye watching from a distance. Pigs fattened all autumn on fallen acorns and beech mast are being killed, one at a time, with practiced, unhurried hands, and strips of dark red meat are already being carried toward a low frame built specially for hanging things in smoke. Children stand well back, watching with the plain, unsqueamish interest of people who have grown up around exactly this yearly work. This is the work that will decide, months in advance and without any second chances allowed for error, whether the night you have just witnessed goes hungry or does not. By midday, the whole yard smells of blood and wood smoke together, a combination nobody here finds remarkable in the slightest. By now the yard has done this often enough that nobody needs instructions, and the year's most demanding day proceeds largely in silence. The date has a name known to every household within reach of this yard, tied to a saint whose feast falls on the 11th day of November, and it arrives on the calendar with the same quiet inevitability as the first hard frost that always seems to follow close behind it, whitening the grass by morning. Nobody here needs telling what today is for. Fodder is already thinning in the fields as the grass stops growing and the ground hardens underfoot. And every animal still standing in the yard this morning represents a choice that has to be made, cleanly and without much sentiment wasted on it, about which mouths this household can actually afford to feed through the coming months of cold and dark. Manor records kept elsewhere note the same day, the same reckoning, repeated across every farm under the same lord's authority. The choice was never really about cruelty, whatever a squeamish later age might assume looking back at it from a warmer distance. It was about arithmetic, plain and unavoidable, worked out the same way every single year by households with no other honest option ever really available to them. You would not call it cruelty if you had stood in this yard through a few Novembers. You would call it the only honest arithmetic available. Look more closely at which animals are actually being led to the fire this morning, and the arithmetic behind it becomes considerably clearer. These are mostly pigs, fattened all season on scraps and fallen nuts gathered from the woods nearby. Animals that were always destined for exactly this day the moment they were first born into the yard, and never intended to see a second winter. Mixed among them are a few older animals, oxen and cart horses, whose working years are plainly behind them now, no longer strong enough to earn their keep at the plough or the wagon. Their joints stiff, their pace slowed past usefulness. Nobody here is killing indiscriminately, whatever the morning's noise and blood might suggest to a squeamish onlooker glancing over the fence. Each animal led to the block this morning has already, quietly, been judged surplus to the household's actual needs for the year ahead, and spared only the pretense that today's decision was anything other than entirely, coldly practical. You are watching a decision made months ago being carried out, rather than a decision being taken now. You have watched this happen every autumn of your life, and the part that would shock a stranger is the part that has long since stopped registering at all. Set apart from all of this, in a separate corner of the same yard, stand the animals that will not go to the knife today, whatever the season demands of everything else around them. A milking cow, heavy and placid, chews steadily at a last mouthful of hay someone has thrown down for her, her breath rising in the cold morning air. 2 or 3 younger beasts, kept specifically for breeding, shift their weight and watch the whole proceedings with the mild, uncomprehending interest animals generally show toward events that do not concern them directly, tails flicking absently at nothing. These animals represent next year's milk, next year's calves, next year's whole working herd, and killing them now simply to save a little fodder over one hard winter would be exactly the kind of short-term thinking this household cannot afford to indulge, whatever the immediate temptation might feel like on a cold, hungry evening still months away, and easy to forget on a morning like this one. You will feel the wisdom of it in February, when the stores have thinned and the temptation to have eaten better in November looks very foolish indeed. So the sorting that actually took place, weeks before this morning ever arrived on the calendar, was neither careless nor complete. It was careful, deliberate, and precisely limited to exactly what the coming winter genuinely required, and not one animal further than that. Someone walked the yard back in early autumn, judging each beast in turn against the season ahead, weighing age and usefulness and the size of the fodder store already gathered in the barn. Only the animals not needed for breeding, not still useful for daily work, and not likely to earn their keep through the cold months ahead, were ever destined for today's fire and blade. Everything else in this yard this morning is simply watching from its own corner, safe for now, while the household does the harder, bloodier, more necessary work of preparing for a season that offers absolutely no second chances if the preparation happens to go wrong somewhere along the way. You keep the breeding stock and the dairy animals, and everything else is measured against fodder that will not stretch as far as spring. The killing itself, when it finally comes, is quick and thoroughly practiced. the work of hands that have done this same grim task every single autumn of their working lives and see no particular reason to make it any harder or slower than it strictly needs to be. What follows the killing, though, stretches on for hours rather than minutes and asks considerably more patience of everyone involved in it, from the eldest down to the children fetching water and stoking the fire beneath the smoking shed. Meat left simply lying about in the autumn air will not preserve itself, however cool the weather has already turned by this point in the season. It has to be dealt with immediately, thoroughly, and in more than one direction at once, while there is still daylight enough left to see clearly what needs doing to each separate part of the animal in its proper turn, before the light fails and the work has to stop for the night. You work through the animal in its proper order, because the light is short, and nothing about this job can be left half-finished overnight. Long wooden troughs of strong brine stand ready at the edge of the yard, already smelling sharply of salt, and into them go the larger cuts of meat, submerged completely and left to soak for days rather than hours. This is not a quick rinse undertaken for the sake of simple cleanliness. It is the first and most essential step in a slow chemical transformation that will let this meat outlast the animal it came from by many months, turning something that would otherwise spoil within a single week into something that will still be perfectly edible and still be actively feeding this household deep into the coldest, darkest part of the coming winter, still stretched out ahead of them. Salt itself is not cheap here, carried some distance from wherever it is dug or boiled, and using so much of it at once is itself a small, deliberate investment in the months ahead. You use a great deal of salt at once, dug or boiled, and spending it now is itself a deliberate investment in the months that follow. Salt was not cheap and not local, and a household that ran short of it in November discovered the fact in a very unpleasant way by February. Once properly brined and lifted dripping from the troughs, the meat is hung carefully on wooden frames and moved into a low, smoky shed built specifically for exactly this purpose and no other. Its walls already dark with years of the same yearly smoke. A slow fire smoulders beneath the hanging strips for hours at a stretch, sometimes for days on end, filling the whole small building with a dense, oily smoke that works its way steadily into the meat and darkens it slowly from the outside in, curing it as much as flavoring it. Someone has to tend that fire through the entire slow process, keeping it low and steady rather than hot and quick, which itself turns out to be a skill built patiently over years of practice, rather than picked up in a single careless afternoon by someone new to the work. You could not learn this in an afternoon. The judgment involved was built across years of doing it badly, and then slightly less badly each time. Nothing here is treated as disposable, whatever a modern eye might assume looking at the mess of the morning's work scattered across the yard. The skins, scraped carefully clean of fat and bristle with a dull blade, are set aside to be cured slowly into usable leather over the weeks that follow, eventually becoming boots or harness or some other durable thing this household will need, before the leather itself is ever quite finished being properly made ready. Even the blood, caught in wide bowls the moment each animal falls, is carried quickly inside and worked, while still warm, into a dense dark pudding thickened with oats or barley, one that will keep about as well as anything else produced by this whole long, careful day of unglamorous, necessary work. Nothing that could still be used was ever simply thrown aside onto the midden without a second thought. Not while so much of the coming winter's comfort depended on exactly this kind of careful, patient thoroughness. You are thorough because the winter is long, and every shortcut taken today becomes a shortage discovered later, when nothing can be done about it. Behind all of this practical labor sits one plain fact that nobody standing in the yard needs to have explained to them out loud, because they have all lived through enough hard winters already to know it somewhere in their bones without thinking about it directly or discussing it over the work. Every animal killed and properly preserved today is, at the very same moment, one less hungry mouth that will need feeding from a fodder store that was already looking distinctly thin even before the first real frost properly arrived to test it against the winter ahead. The work happening in this one yard is quietly solving two entirely separate problems with the very same single afternoon's hard effort. And everyone present understands both halves of that equation, without a single word ever needing to be spoken about it aloud between them. Nobody needed a ledger to work this out formally. It was simply understood, the way weather itself was understood, by everyone old enough to have lived through a few winters already. You would understand the timing the way you understand weather, having lived through enough Novembers to stop needing anyone to explain it to you. The other half of that same equation, of course, is standing right in front of them the whole time, hanging steadily in the low smokehouse and soaking patiently in the brine troughs nearby, filling the yard with its particular sharp, smoky smell. Every strip of meat preserved today becomes part of exactly the same larder that will feed this household through the long, fieldless months, still stretched out ahead of it, right up until the ground finally thaws enough in spring for planting to properly begin again in earnest. There is no convenient market trip planned for the depths of January to fill any awkward gaps that turn up later in the season. Whatever is preserved today, and only exactly that, is what this household will actually have left to live on once the real, biting cold finally sets in for good, and the roads themselves grow difficult to travel. You are reducing the number of mouths the farm must feed, and building the larder at the same time, which is why the date never moved. You are doing two jobs with one day's work, which is the only reason the labor is worth the enormous effort it demands of everyone in the yard. For a few short days around this single busy stretch of killing and preserving, the household eats considerably better than it usually does through the rest of the year. And there is a simple, entirely unsentimental reason behind that small burst of plenty. Fresh meat, cut straight from an animal only hours dead, has not yet gone through the brine or the smoke that will eventually let it keep for months on end without spoiling in the meantime. It will spoil within days if simply left untreated on a shelf somewhere in the autumn air. So the sensible thing, really the only sensible thing available to them, is to eat some of it promptly, while it is still genuinely fresh, rather than let good meat rot away entirely while everyone stands about waiting politely for some more dignified moment to enjoy it properly instead. You eat the fresh meat now because it cannot wait, and the feast that results is a consequence of preservation limits rather than of celebration. That short stretch of unusually good eating is the entire practical origin of what later generations would remember fondly and considerably more romantically as a proper autumn feast worth marking on the calendar every single year without fail, complete with its own small rituals and expectations. Not indulgence pursued purely for its own sake at all, in plain truth, but simply a household making sensible use of the freshest parts of a much larger, much more careful piece of seasonal work, one that would otherwise have gone quietly to waste for no better reason than good manners or misplaced patience holding everyone back from eating it while it was still actually at its best. That single practical fact, repeated on farms across the whole region every autumn without fail, is the entire quiet truth behind a custom that would later be remembered as something far grander than it ever really was. You will hear this remembered later as something far grander than it was. Tonight it is simply the part of the cull that could not be salted. The grandeur was applied afterwards by people who had never had to decide which animals would not see spring. By the time the light finally begins to fail on this long working day, the actual shape of the whole enterprise has become clear enough for anyone watching closely to understand it properly at last. From the morning's first blade to this evening's hanging, darkening strips of meat, this was never a wholesale slaughter, a yard simply emptied of every living thing for the sake of it. It was a careful, deliberate sorting, precisely limited in scope, that spared exactly the animals this household will need come spring and preserved, with real skill and real sustained effort stretched across the whole day. Everything genuinely useful that could reasonably be taken from the animals it did not spare from the blade. Even the fat rendered down from the trimmings had its own place in the household's plans, stored carefully in a sealed pot for cooking through the winter and for greasing whatever leather needed it before the cold set in properly. You seal the rendered fat away for cooking through the winter, and for greasing whatever leather needs it before the cold properly arrives. Salt, smoke, patient hands, and days of thoroughly unglamorous labor turned a yard full of living, breathing, hungry animals into a store of food that will still be quietly feeding this same household deep into the darkest, coldest weeks of winter, long after any clear memory of today's actual work has faded from everyone's immediate attention entirely, and the yard itself has gone quiet again. Nothing about the whole process was quick, and nothing about it was ever accidental or left to chance for even a moment. Every strip of meat now hanging in that low smokehouse represents a specific, deliberate decision made earlier this very same busy day, weighed and judged before a single blade was even lifted. A neighbor walking past the smokehouse that same evening would have smelled exactly the same smoke rising from a dozen other yards nearby, each household working through the identical seasonal task at roughly the identical time. You are not alone in any of this. A dozen yards nearby are working through the identical task at the identical time, exactly as they do every year. The whole parish moves through the same week of work, and the smell of it hangs over every yard between here and the church. And every one of those small decisions, taken together across the whole long day of work, adds up to something considerably larger than any single choice could ever manage on its own standing alone. The whole household's real chance of making it safely through to spring, worked out here, today, in an ordinary autumn yard that will not feel even slightly warm or golden again until the following year turns all the way back around to meet it once more, months from now. This is the quiet, unglamorous labor that the household you visited earlier tonight was actually entirely living on, spoonful by spoonful, without a single thought spared for how carefully it had gotten there in the first place. Multiply this 1 yard by every farm within reach of the same market town, and the true scale of the autumn's work becomes clear. An entire district quietly provisioning itself, household by household, against the same coming winter. The whole district provisions itself in parallel, house by house, without anyone coordinating it beyond the shared date sitting on the calendar. As the light finally fades from the yard, the last strips of meat are lifted from the smokehouse frame and carried inside to join the rest of the steadily growing store, already stacked against the wall, dark and ready. The breeding stock, spared for another year running, is led back to its own separate shelter, still chewing placidly on the last of the day's hay, entirely unaware of how narrowly the morning's careful decisions had gone in its particular favor today. And the household, tired now in a different way than the winter night still weeks ahead of them, turns back toward the house and the ordinary business of the evening meal, the larder behind them quietly, finally, completely finished for another whole year. You leave the larder finished for another whole year, and the evening meal that follows is the first ordinary thing anyone here has done since dawn. Move now to a different evening, still deep in the same winter, in a different room a short walk from the house you first visited tonight. A handful of women sit close together around a single fire, each with a distaff tucked under one arm and a spindle turning steadily between practiced fingers that barely seem to need watching anymore after so many years of the same motion. Raw wool, carded soft and straight already, waits in wide baskets at their feet, ready to be drawn out gradually and twisted into usable thread. Thread by careful thread, hour after hour. This is not idle time. Whatever the outward quiet of the room might first suggest to someone glancing in from outside the door, on their way past on some other errand, it only looks that way because the work happening here asks almost nothing of the body and almost everything, instead of patient, unhurried attention, the kind that can stretch comfortably across an entire long, dark evening without ever once feeling rushed or urgent to anyone taking part in it around the fire. Even the youngest among them has already learnt the basic motion, hands guided patiently by an older woman's hands the first several times. The motion is taught hand to hand rather than explained, which is why it survives in rooms like this one without ever being written down anywhere. You settle in among them, close enough to feel the fire properly and hear the small, steady sounds of the work itself. wool drawn slowly out, spindle turning, thread gradually lengthening in careful, unhurried hands that know exactly what they are doing, without needing to look down at them even once during the whole long conversation. Outside, the fields lie entirely still under whatever frost or snow the night has brought this time, asking nothing at all of anyone until spring eventually returns to wake them properly again from their long, patient rest. Inside, by contrast, the evening is full, occupied comfortably from one end to the other by this same steady, sociable handwork. Women gathered together doing the one particular kind of labour that winter's long dark hours seem to have been made specifically for. Year after returning year, in room after room across the countryside, winter evenings were made for exactly this, with the fields resting and the light too poor for anything demanding real precision. The wool has to be carded before it can be spun, and both jobs suit a room where the light is poor and the company is good. With the fields resting and daylight cut down sharply to only a few short hours each day at this time of year, medieval winter evenings across the whole surrounding countryside were filled, again and again, in house after ordinary house, with exactly this kind of steady indoor handwork done together by shared firelight, rather than done alone in silence. Women spun thread on distaff and spindle, or carded raw wool straight in preparation for spinning it properly by hand later that same evening. Men mended tools nearby, or carved some small necessary object the household needed for the season ahead, working comfortably by the very same shared light as everyone else gathered in the room around them. Children moved between both kinds of work as they grew older, quietly learning which tasks would eventually become their own to manage entirely alone, without instruction, simply by watching closely enough over many winters. A visitor arriving from a busier season might mistake the quiet scene for laziness, until they noticed how much thread had actually accumulated by the time the fire finally burned down for the night. You would not notice the thread accumulating either, until you looked down near the end of the evening and found how much of it there suddenly was. This particular room tonight holds mostly spinners, women who know each other's hands and habits well enough after years of shared winter evenings together to talk easily while their fingers keep working steadily without needing to be watched too closely by anyone else nearby in the room. Spinning itself, once truly learnt properly over years of steady practice, becomes almost entirely automatic, the kind of practiced motion a body can keep making steadily hour after hour while the mind wanders freely off somewhere else entirely, into easy conversation or old memory, or whatever small piece of local gossip happens to be quietly circulating around the fire this particular evening, in this particular room full of familiar faces who have heard most of each other's stories before, more than once, and do not mind hearing them again. Nobody minds the repetition of the stories, because the point was never the story, the point was the company, which makes the work bearable. Before any of tonight's thread can actually be properly spun, though, the raw wool itself first has to be carded, combed out straight and even between two flat, spiked wooden paddles until every tangled fibre lies obediently in the very same direction as its neighbours, ready to be drawn smoothly rather than pulled and snagged partway through. It is slow, repetitive, faintly tedious work by any honest measure, needing very little real strength and even less particular skill to do adequately, which is precisely why it so often fell, in households everywhere across the country, to whoever happened to have a spare pair of hands free at that moment, including, quite regularly, and without much complaint from anyone involved, children old enough to sit reasonably still and repeat the same simple motion for an hour at a stretch, without losing patience with it entirely before the fire itself burned low and the evening properly ended. Carding is combing the raw wool straight before it can be spun, slow and repetitive, and needing little strength, which is why it went to whoever was nearest. A pair of cards worked steadily produces a great deal less than it feels like, which is one reason the work suited an evening rather than a morning. A child assigned to carding for a whole long evening might reasonably wonder, without ever quite saying so aloud in front of the grown women nearby who set the tasks each night, whether they had simply distributed the more interesting half of the evening's work to themselves and quietly kept the duller half moving steadily downhill toward the youngest hands in the room, as always seemed to happen. Nobody ever explained the arrangement out loud in so many words, and nobody, particularly, ever needed to justify it either to anyone who asked. It was simply how a winter evening's labour got itself sorted out in any room with more than one pair of hands and more than one task still needing doing before the fire finally burnt down too low for anyone to see properly by any longer that night. There is always more of it waiting, and the evening ends when the fire does rather than when the work finally runs out. The distaff itself, the plain wooden staff that holds a soft cloud of combed wool ready and waiting for the spindle to draw steadily from as the thread lengthens hour by hour, was so closely bound up with women's ordinary daily work across the whole period that it stood, in a real sense, as something close to a general symbol for it, recognized instantly by anyone who saw one being carried down a lane. Spinning was never confined only to quiet evenings like this one beside the fire, either. It could be, and very often was, carried on almost anywhere at all, while walking briskly to market, while minding animals out in a field, while simply waiting for water to boil over the fire, the distaff tucked casually under one arm wherever its owner happened to be standing that particular day, rain or shine, morning or evening alike. It travelled easily from house to house too, whenever one woman needed to borrow a little wool or company from a neighbour on an otherwise solitary evening. The distaff held the raw fibre ready for spinning, and it was so bound up with women's work that it stood as a general symbol for it entirely. It stood for women's work so completely that the word itself came to mean the female side of a household, long after anyone stopped explaining why. Tonight, though, is dedicated properly and deliberately to it, an evening set aside specifically for spinning in good company, rather than spinning merely squeezed in around some other more pressing task, competing for attention through the day. And where women gathered together like this, evening after evening, through one long winter after another, stretching back further than anyone could easily remember or name precisely, something considerably beyond mere thread inevitably got made alongside it. A shared, ongoing exchange of talk, opinion, folk remedy, and story, passed back and forth freely across the fire while the spindles themselves kept quietly, steadily turning the whole time, almost unnoticed beneath the flow of conversation and laughter around them. Even a household with only one or two spinners still valued this kind of evening enough to invite a neighbour in, rather than let the thread get made in solitary silence with no one to share the work. Company was part of the arrangement rather than a break from it, and a neighbour invited in was one more pair of hands, as well as one more voice. One remarkable trace of exactly that shared culture happens to survive even now, many centuries later, in the form of a genuine 15th century French collection of exactly this kind of fireside talk, carefully gathered and written down under the title of the Distaff Gospels, a title that names the very tool these women are holding tonight without needing further explanation. It presents itself as an evening's worth, or perhaps several evenings' worth, of household wisdom, folk remedies, and tall tales, supposedly exchanged among a group of women who had gathered together, precisely as these women have tonight, specifically to spin steadily through the long winter dark hours together, one tale prompting the next around the fire late into the night. Copies of that same collection would go on being read, and laughed over, and argued with, for a very long time after the particular evening that inspired it had been entirely forgotten by everyone who lived through it. The Distaff Gospels survives from 15th century France, presenting itself as the collected sayings of women talking exactly like this over their work. It presents itself as a record of women's talk across several evenings, which makes it a rare thing, ordinary company written down while it was still ordinary. Whatever you personally make of any single piece of advice recorded in that old surviving collection, and admittedly some of it reads rather stranger to modern ears than other parts of it do, its real value here tonight is simpler and more solid than any one individual claim it happens to make about remedies or omens or the behaviour of husbands. It is direct, tangible evidence that evenings exactly like this one, women spinning together by firelight through a long winter, genuinely produced their own ongoing culture of shared talk, rather than merely silent, solitary handwork endured separately by each woman alone inside her own private thoughts, unheard and unshared by anyone else gathered in the same firelit room. What survives in the end is not proof that every word spoken by that fire was wise or even sensible, only proof that the fire itself and the talk around it was real and ordinary and shared. The collection is not evidence that the sayings were wise, it is evidence that the evenings were real and shared and thought worth writing down. It would be a real mistake, all the same, to hear the word rest applied so easily to this whole season and picture something closer to true, complete idleness stretching lazily across the winter months. The fields outside may genuinely be resting. That much is true enough to say plainly and honestly, but the household's own broader work has simply shifted indoors for the season, rather than stopped altogether in any real sense worth pretending. Manure still has to be spread out carefully onto fields well before spring planting can properly begin again in earnest come the thaw. Fruit trees need careful, patient pruning while they still stand entirely bare of leaves and easy to see clearly against the winter sky. Tools worn or quietly broken through the previous season's harvest need mending long before they will be needed again in earnest come spring's eventual return. Tools from the previous harvest need mending long before spring asks anything of them again. A scythe left unmended in November is a scythe that fails in June, when there is no time whatsoever to spare for fixing it. Winter's real, particular gift to a household like this one was never genuine idleness, then, whatever a distant, romantic later age might prefer to imagine comfortably about it, from a safe historical distance removed from the actual cold and the actual work. It was simply this one specific, welcome mercy, and no more than that its necessary work, for this one stretch of the year at least, could finally be done sitting close together by a warm and steady fire, rather than standing bent over uncomfortably in a cold, wet field from first light until the last of the day's grey daylight finally gave out entirely and forced everyone indoors, regardless of whatever still needed doing outside before dark. A field left entirely alone through the cold months would recover on its own eventually, but a household left entirely idle through the same months would not fare nearly so well when spring finally arrived to test it. Manure still had to be spread and fruit trees pruned, so the slower season was never actually idle for anyone paying proper attention. Nothing about winter released a household from work. It only changed which work there was and moved most of it indoors near the fire. So the evening continues on, unhurried and easy, thread steadily lengthening on each turning spindle, wool steadily carded down to almost nothing in the baskets at everyone's feet. Talk rising and falling easily around the fire, the particular way it only ever does among people who have shared this exact same room, this exact same task, on countless earlier evenings very much like this one, stretching back over many winters spent together in the very same seats by the very same fire, year after year without fail. Nobody here tonight is in any particular hurry to finish early or move on to something else more pressing. The whole quiet point of a winter evening, in its own gentle way, is precisely that there is nowhere else more urgent to be than exactly here, tonight, among these particular friends. There is nowhere more urgent to be, which is a condition this household experiences for only a few months out of the year. Nowhere else to be, nothing outdoors that cannot wait, and a fire that will hold for a few more hours yet. Slowly, as the fire itself begins to settle and burn lower in the grate, the talk around the room thins gradually along with it, sentences growing shorter, comfortable pauses growing longer and easier between them as the evening wears on toward its natural, unhurried close. One spindle stops turning at last, then another not long after, each set down finally against a basket now nearly empty of its raw wool after a whole evening's steady, patient work. The evening's real work, whatever particular shape it actually took tonight, thread or talk, or simply the shared warmth of the room itself, has by now been thoroughly, unhurriedly, properly done, with nothing left undone that genuinely needed finishing before the fire gave out entirely for the night. The fire itself needs no further tending tonight beyond what has already been done, and everyone in the room seems to sense the evening's natural end arriving without anyone needing to announce it out loud. The evening ends without announcement, the way it always does, once the fire drops below the point where anyone can still see their own hands. One by one, the women gather up their thread and their tools and rise from their places by the fire, wrapping cloaks close against the sharp cold, waiting for them just outside the door. Quiet good nights pass easily around the room, unhurried and warm. Promises made without much thought to meet again the following evening at the same fire, same seats, same small circle of familiar faces, and the small familiar group drifts apart at last into the dark, each woman making her own short, cold way home through the night, toward her own particular hearth, her own particular household, and whatever remains of this same long winter night still waiting there patiently to receive her at the door. Tomorrow evening, or the one after that, the same small group will very likely gather again at the same fire, the same distaffs in hand, picking up a conversation that never really needed to be finished tonight in the first place. The conversation is left unfinished deliberately, because there will be another night like this one tomorrow, and another one after that. Rise now, gently, above the one house you have spent this whole night inside, above the yard where the autumn slaughter was carefully finished weeks ago, above the quiet room where the spinners sat together by their fire earlier this same evening, and look out over the whole small village these separate scenes have all, in their own particular way, belonged to from the very start of this long night. Snow lies thick and even across every roof in sight, smoothing sharp edges into soft, rounded shapes under a clear, hard, star-filled winter sky stretching endlessly overhead in every direction. Here and there, a thin thread of smoke still rises from a rooftop, slow and steady, the only visible sign left that anyone at all, anywhere below in this whole sleeping village, is still even faintly awake tonight, this deep into the darkest, quietest hours before dawn. From this height, the village looks smaller and more fragile than it ever does from inside any one of its own firelit rooms. From up here the arrangement looks precarious. From inside any one of those rooms it does not feel remotely that way. Every one of these snow-covered roofs, without a single exception anywhere in view across the whole settlement, sits above essentially the same basic arrangement you have already come to know so closely tonight. House by separate house across the whole huddled village. A single open room, most often, with no upper floor and no true chimney cut through it anywhere at all. A central hearth burning low and steady on bare earth, its smoke rising freely upward into open rafters overhead, exactly as it has done in houses built this particular way for longer than anyone currently sleeping beneath them could say with any real certainty or precision. Generation folding quietly into generation without much changing at all in the shape of the houses themselves. Even the smallest, humblest house at the edge of the village follows this same basic pattern, no different in its essentials from the largest household nearer the church. The largest household nearer the church is running the same system on a larger scale, with the same open fire and the same open roof above it. That smoke, thin and unhurried above each separate roof tonight, finds its own quiet way out through a plain, lantern-shaped opening cut directly above each individual house's own hearth, rather than through any proper flue clever enough to carry it away more discreetly out of sight and mind entirely. Seen from up here, scattered across the whole huddled village all at once under the same wide, star-filled sky, those pale threads of slowly rising smoke look almost like a slow, silent kind of breathing, each separate house its own quiet exhale released steadily into the cold, clear night air hanging above it. One small sign of life after another repeated the length of the village, roof after sleeping roof. A traveller crossing open country on a night like this would see those same faint threads of smoke long before any house itself came into view. The surest sign for miles that shelter was somewhere near at hand, Smoke rising through thatch was visible long before any building was, and travellers learnt to read it as the nearest thing to a signpost available. Wood smoke drifting through a thatched roof carries a long way in cold air, and a traveller could follow it to shelter before ever seeing a wall. Grand houses elsewhere, belonging to considerably wealthier households than any gathered together in this particular small village tonight, are slowly, unevenly beginning to build proper chimneys and separate private chambers of their own, one grand hall at a time, in places far removed from here. That gradual change has not reached this small huddle of ordinary roofs tonight, and honestly will not reach it for a good while yet to come. Perhaps not in the lifetime of anyone sleeping beneath them right now. Every house you can see from up here, without one single exception anywhere below, is doing exactly what houses just like it have always done on a night this cold, keeping its hard-won warmth carefully in, and simply making its peace, once again, with the smoke that same warmth always brings along with it, as it always has, every winter, without complaint. A wealthier visitor passing through in later years might find the whole arrangement crude by his own standards, and entirely miss how well it actually served the people living inside it. A later visitor would find the whole arrangement crude, and would be measuring it against comforts nobody here has any reason to expect. Beneath more than one of these snow-covered roofs tonight, a family shares its own single room with its own tethered animals close by, the two kept deliberately close together for exactly the same practical reason you have already come to understand so well from the house you visited earlier this same long night. A shared byre end, a shared passage in from the biting cold outside, and the same slow, steady body heat of cattle and sheep, quietly warming the very same firelit air the family itself is breathing tonight, all repeated across this one small, snow-covered village at once. House after separate house, roof after separate roof, each one its own small, faithful version of the same arrangement that keeps them alive. A stranger passing through by daylight might never guess, from the outside alone, which houses held animals and which did not, since every roofline along the lane looks much the same beneath its blanket of snow. Under snow the rooflines give nothing away, and which houses hold animals is a matter of local knowledge rather than of observation. Under still more of these roofs, the arrangement runs closer to the true longhouse pattern, one long building holding both the family's living space and its animals' shelter beneath a single unbroken roofline, divided only by a low partition wall or simply by a stretch of open floor running between the two halves of the same building under one roof. No chimney separates the two ends here, any more than it separates the people from their own smoke elsewhere in the village tonight. One shared roof, one central fire, one shared warmth, quietly repeated house after house, the whole length of this sleeping village tonight, from one end of the settlement to the other, without a single house built any differently. Whichever exact arrangement a given house happens to follow, byre end or divided room, the underlying logic driving it is identical from one end of the village to the other. Warmth shared costs less than warmth wasted. Warmth shared costs less than warmth wasted. And that single principle explains nearly every arrangement visible from this ridge tonight. The same logic runs from one end of the village to the other, and none of it was ever written down as a policy by anyone. That particular closeness between people and their animals, so entirely ordinary here tonight, that nobody beneath any of these roofs would ever think twice to remark on it to a neighbour over the fence, belongs to an arrangement that will only slowly, gradually loosen its hold across the centuries still to come after this one, long after everyone sleeping here tonight has lived out their lives and gone. Solid walls will eventually rise between them. Upper floors will eventually be built in overhead, carving out private rooms where none exist here now. But not yet, and certainly not in this particular village, on this particular night, where every single house still holds its family and its animals together under one warm, smoky, shared roof, exactly as it always has for as long as anyone here can remember, or their parents before them could remember either. For now, though, that later comfort remains only a distant, unimagined possibility, and nobody sleeping here tonight has any reason to feel its absence as a lack. Enclosed fireplaces, and upper floors lie somewhere ahead in the century. Nobody sleeping tonight experiences their absence as any kind of lack. The comforts that would later seem essential have not been invented here yet, and their absence is felt by absolutely nobody lying down tonight. Behind more than one of these snow-covered doors, too, sits a store of salted, smoke-darkened meat, very much like the one you saw carefully hung and finished in that autumn yard some weeks earlier, in almost exactly the same way, on almost exactly the same day of the year. Breeding animals were kept back everywhere across this whole village, in exactly the same careful way, spared deliberately from the same November culling that filled every household's larder at once, on the very same practical terms, following the very same quiet, unspoken understanding shared naturally by everyone who farms this same cold stretch of land, year after year, without ever needing to compare notes about it across the fence, separating one yard from the next. Nobody in this village would have described that autumn work as remarkable in any way, since every household for miles around was doing precisely the same thing, at precisely the same time of year, as it always had. Every household for miles did the same thing at the same time of year, which is why the whole valley smells faintly of salt and smoke through November. The salting, the smoke, and the shortening light arrive together every year, and the village has long since stopped treating their coincidence as remarkable. The whole village, in other words, made essentially the same set of careful decisions this past autumn, at essentially the same time as one another, for essentially the same unavoidable, practical reasons shared by every household working this same land under the same lord, the same seasons, the same sky. Fewer animals to feed through the hardest, hungriest months of deep winter still ahead of them all. More salted, smoked meat set safely aside against exactly the kind of long, cold night now settled so completely and evenly over every single roof you can see from up here, unbroken from one end of the village to the other. One household's careful autumn labor quietly multiplied across an entire sleeping village at once, without any single household needing to think of itself as unusual in any way. Nobody planned it as a collective effort in any formal sense. It simply arose, house by house, from the same hard necessity facing everyone equally. It was never organized. It simply arose, house by house, from a necessity that pressed on everyone equally and required no committee to arrange it. So picture it now, all together, all at the very same moment, the whole village held in one long, quiet breath under the falling snow. Beneath every one of these snow-covered roofs, a banked fire glows low and steady in the dark, tended carefully down to embers, rather than left to burn out entirely by morning and need relighting from cold ash and flint. Animals stand settled and still in their own warm corner of each shared room. A larder, filled faithfully since autumn, waits quietly in the dark nearby, close at hand, ready for whenever it happens to be needed next, whatever the weather still has left to bring before spring. The exact same arrangement, repeated patiently house after house, roof after snow-covered roof, the whole length of this one sleeping village stretched out below the stars. Nothing about tonight required anything more dramatic than that simple repeated arrangement carried out quietly, house by house, across the whole settlement. No single house down there is doing anything unusual, or especially clever, or meaningfully different from its close neighbors either side of it, along the same snowy lane. Every one of them arrived at winter already prepared, already properly provisioned, already arranged exactly the way its own particular roofline and its own particular hearth had always, quietly dictated to it over many years of the same season returning without fail. The whole village simply repeats, quietly and entirely without fuss, the very same coherent answer to the very same long, cold night, together, each house keeping faith with all the others. A visitor arriving at any single house here tonight, quite by chance, would find almost exactly the same fire, the same sleeping animals, the same larder, waiting behind almost exactly the same door. Winter asked a very great deal of careful preparation from every one of these households. Back in the golden, busy, hurried weeks of autumn now well behind them, and already fading from everyone's immediate memory, It asks remarkably little of the actual night itself. Once all of that earlier work has already, properly, been thoroughly finished and put away in its proper place against the wall. That, in the end, is the whole of the quiet, unglamorous secret behind why this particular season could ever honestly be called the gentlest one of the entire year. However cold and dark it plainly, undeniably still is tonight. Out here under the snow and stars, watching patiently over the whole sleeping village below, that, more than any single custom or preserved store of meat, is the real and complete answer to the strange claim this whole night set out, quietly, to test from its very first moment. The snow keeps falling, soft and steady, thickening slowly over every single sleeping roof at once, filling in the last visible edges of the village below, until barely a line remains between one roof and the next. One by one, the thin threads of rising smoke grow fainter, and fainter still, as each banked fire settles further down into its own quiet bed of grey ash, somewhere below the snow-heavy roofs. Soon there is only snow, and stillness, and darkness gathered evenly over the whole small, sleeping village at once. Every household inside it finally, completely, gratefully at rest for the night, until the light returns to wake them all again. By morning, when the light finally returns and the smoke begins to thicken again above each waking roof, this same village will simply begin the whole patient cycle over, one more ordinary day at a time. There is nothing left now to learn, and nothing left to do, and nowhere at all that you need to be. So let it all begin, gently, to fade. Let the smoky house go first, the banked fire, the settled animals, the one small rushlight, the pot that never quite stops. Let it all soften and recede and grow faint, until it is only a small remembered warmth somewhere far behind you in the dark. You do not need to hold on to any of it. It is safe to let it go. There is only the dark now, and it is soft, and it is kind, and it is enough. Let the autumn yard fade next. The smokehouse, the brine troughs, the breeding stock led safely back to its shelter. Let it all soften and recede and grow quiet, until it too is only a faint and fading warmth somewhere far off in the settling dark. You do not need to follow it. You do not need to keep it. Let the night take it, gently, the way the night takes everything and asks for nothing back. Breathe slowly. There is nothing left that you must do. Let the spinner's quiet room fade too. The distaffs set aside, the baskets empty of wool, the last low talk around the dying fire. Let them all grow faint and far and still, until they are only the memory of a warmth dissolving quietly into the night. You are not far behind them now. Your thoughts are slowing. The edges of everything are going soft. Let the last of it loosen and fall away, and let yourself begin, at last, to sink down after them. Let the sleeping village fade last of all. Let the snow keep falling over roofs you can no longer quite picture. Let the thin threads of smoke grow fainter and fainter still until they are gone. There is nothing left to watch over now. So let the last light go. Let the last sound fade. Let the darkness close gently over all of it, the way sleep closes over a long day, and rest now, fully, in the deep and quiet dark that is left when everything else is softly gone. Now there is only the fire, only a low bed of embers in the dark, glowing faint and warm and red, breathing softly to itself, asking nothing of you at all. Everything else has faded gently away. There is nothing more to hear, and nothing more to know, and nothing more that needs to be said. The words are done now. Only the quiet warmth remains, and the soft red light, and the deep and easy dark all around it. Let your breath grow slow. There is only the fire now, and it will keep. Rest. You are warm, you are safe, and the night will hold you, gently, all the way through, until the morning comes.